Something happened to British glider pilots in the Second World War that happened to no one else. Not the Americans, not the Germans, not the Soviets. Nobody else had it, and almost nobody talks about it today. These men were trained to fly. They learned to navigate, to read air currents, to handle a machine with no engine across enemy territory in complete silence. They did all the things you would expect from a military pilot. But then, unlike every other pilot in every other air force in the world, when they landed, they were expected to pick up a rifle and fight, not retreat to safety, not wait for rescue, not hand off to ground troops and walk away. Fight. Door to door, trench to trench, field to field. They were pilots who became infantry the moment their wheels hit the ground. And the training behind that transformation was unlike anything any other nation attempted, before or since. Most people who know anything about World War II gliders know the big moments. Arnhem, Normandy, Market Garden, Sicily. They know the wooden aircraft and the dangerous landings and the heavy losses. But what they do not know, what rarely gets discussed, is how those men were prepared for what came after the landing. Because getting a glider down in one piece was only the beginning. What happened next was where the real training showed its teeth. If you have any interest at all in the forgotten corners of World War II, the stories that never made it into the textbooks, stick around, because this one goes deep. Subscribe if you want more of this. There is a lot more where this comes from. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Not to the landings themselves, but to the moment when someone in the British military looked at the idea of a glider pilot and asked a question no one had thought to ask before. What happens to him after he lands? That question, simple as it sounds, changed everything. In the early days of the war, the British were still figuring out what airborne forces were even supposed to be. The Germans had demonstrated the concept dramatically at Épinay-Malmel in 1940, when a small force of glider troops captured a Belgian fortress in under 20 minutes. The Luftwaffe had glider pilots who landed their machines and then got out of the way. They were transport crew. Their job was delivery. Once the cargo, meaning the troops, was off the aircraft, the pilot was done. He found shelter, waited, and got evacuated when possible. That was the model. Pilot delivers troops. Troops do the fighting. Pilot waits. The British looked at that model and rejected it. Not because it was wrong on its face, but because of a cold mathematical reality. When you land a glider in enemy territory, you are behind enemy lines with a finite number of fighting men. Every able-bodied person on that operation matters. Every rifle counts. And when a glider lands, there might be 2 pilots sitting in the front of that aircraft doing nothing, while soldiers who just spent a rough flight being thrown around in a wooden box stumble out and immediately start fighting. The pilots are trained, they are fit, they are armed, and they are doing nothing. That was the waste the British could not accept. So they built something new. They built the Glider Pilot Regiment, and from the moment it was conceived, it was unlike any other unit in the British military. The regiment was formally established in 1942, and it operated under a concept that its founders called total soldier. The phrase sounds simple. The reality was brutal. A total soldier was a man who was not just a pilot who could handle a weapon if he had to. He was a fully trained infantry soldier who also happened to be a qualified military pilot, both to the same standard, both without compromise. This was not a compromise position. It was not a men who can do a bit of everything approach. The standard was explicit. The glider pilot was expected to fly his aircraft to the target with the same level of skill as any other military aviator, and then, after landing, he was expected to fight with the same effectiveness as any other infantry soldier. No lowering of the bar, no softening of either requirement. Both, completely, at the same time. The man behind much of this thinking was George Chatterton, who would become the commanding officer of the Glider Pilot Regiment and who pushed harder than anyone for the total soldier standard. Chatterton had a clear view of what glider pilots were going to face in combat. He understood that these men would land in places where the fighting was already happening, or was about to happen, that there would be no safe rear area for them to retreat to, and that the operation would depend on every single person contributing to the fight. He pushed for training that reflected that reality, not training that prepared men to survive the landing, but training that prepared them to dominate what came after it. And what did that training actually look like? It started with selection. Not every man who wanted to fly gliders was accepted into the Glider Pilot Regiment. The selection process screened for men who had the right combination of physical fitness, mental resilience, and aptitude for both flying and soldiering. Men who were purely comfortable in an aircraft but struggled with the infantry side were not what was needed. Men who were natural soldiers but lacked the coordination and judgment for flight were equally unsuitable. The regiment needed both in the same body, and the selection process was designed to find them. Once selected, the men began a training pipeline that was genuinely extraordinary in its scope. The flying training was conducted through the Army Air Corps, with student pilots going through elementary and advanced flying on powered aircraft before transitioning to gliders. This was not a shortcut. These men were trained as proper military aviators, understanding navigation, meteorology, formation flying, night operations, and the particular challenges of glider flight, which included the complete absence of any second chance. A powered aircraft pilot whose engine fails has options. He can restart it, he can climb for altitude, he can pick his moment. A glider pilot whose tow rope is cut, or who has passed the release point, has exactly one approach. He makes it work, or he crashes. The technical demands of military glider flying were significant and should not be understated. The Horsa glider, which became the standard British military glider, was a large aircraft. It could carry up to 30 soldiers or equivalent cargo. It had a wingspan of 88 feet and weighed over 8,000 pounds empty. Landing one of these machines on a farm field in Normandy at night, in formation, under fire, having been towed from England, was not something a man with a few weekends of hobby flying could do. The pilots trained extensively on formation flying because glider operations involved dozens or sometimes hundreds of aircraft arriving at the same landing zone within a narrow time window. The risks of collision were real. The demands of navigation in poor visibility were real. The challenges of landing on unprepared surfaces in darkness or smoke were real. The flying side of the training was serious and demanding. But then came the other half. Once the flying training was complete, the glider pilots did not go to an airbase and wait. They went to infantry school. Real infantry school. The same kind that produced the fighting soldiers of the British Army. Weapons training was thorough and intensive. These men learned to handle not just the standard infantry rifle, but the Bren light machine gun, the Sten submachine gun, mortars, the Piat anti-tank weapon, and grenades. They learned to strip and reassemble these weapons under pressure and in darkness. They learned to maintain them in field conditions. They learned marksmanship to infantry standards, not to the minimal self-defense standard that most aircrew received. Tactics were taught at the individual level and at the section and platoon level. These men learned how to move through built-up areas, how to clear buildings room by room, how to set up defensive positions and hold them, how to attack fixed positions, how to handle contact with enemy infantry, and how to maintain cohesion as a unit when things went wrong. And things, in airborne operations, almost always went wrong, months to 2 years. This was a significant investment in a single soldier. But the British military had concluded that the alternative, sending men into combat with half the skills they needed, was worse. Now, here is what makes this particularly striking when you compare it to how other nations handled the same problem. The Americans operated a glider force throughout the war. The first real test came in North Africa and then Sicily in 1943, in an operation called Ladbroke. This was the British airborne losses, and the complete failure of the operational plan began to fight. The 73 men who reached Ponte Grande seized the bridge and held it against Italian counterattacks for hours. They were eventually overwhelmed and forced to release the bridge, but by then, the ground forces were close enough to recapture it within the hour. The action at Ponte Grande was not a glittering success in terms of numbers or logistics, but it demonstrated something important. These men, having survived an aerial catastrophe, having landed in the wrong places, having lost most of their comrades to the sea, could organize themselves, move to an objective, and fight with tactical effectiveness. That was not an accident. That was the training. The lessons of Sicily were absorbed and applied. By the time Operation Overlord was being planned, the glider operations for D-Day were more carefully thought through, better navigated, and better integrated with the overall plan. The British contribution to the Normandy airborne assault included the landing at Pegasus Bridge, which has become one of the most famous airborne actions of the war. 6 Horsa gliders carried men of D Company, 2nd Battalion the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, led by Major John Howard. 3 of the gliders landed within meters of Pegasus Bridge, one of the most precise glider landings in history, achieved in darkness. The bridge was seized within minutes. The German garrison was overwhelmed before it could respond. The glider pilots who had brought the assault force to that objective did not step back after landing. They took up positions as part of the perimeter defense. They fought alongside the soldiers they had delivered. And when the relief column arrived, the defense was still holding. This was the total soldier concept in action. The pilots had done their job in the air, with precision that bordered on miraculous, and then they had picked up their weapons and done their job on the ground. The story of Pegasus Bridge is well known. The role of the glider pilots in the defense that followed the landing is less often discussed, but it was real, and it mattered. The bigger test came in September 1944 with Operation Market Garden. This was the largest airborne operation in history, and the British component included the assault on Arnhem, which aimed to seize the bridge over the Rhine. The operation has been analyzed exhaustively, and its failure is usually attributed to a combination of poor intelligence, bad weather that delayed reinforcement, stiff German resistance from SS Panzer units that happened to be in the area, and communication failures that left the men at the bridge isolated. But what is often lost in the analysis of Market Garden is what the glider pilot regiment did during those 9 days. The pilots of the regiment did not land their gliders and retire to a safe area. They were organized into fighting units and assigned to the defensive perimeter. They held sections of the line around the Arnhem perimeter that was gradually contracting as the German pressure increased. They fought in the streets, in gardens, in buildings, in the rubble of what had been a Dutch market town. They used the weapons they had been trained to use, the Brens and Stens and Piats, against infantry and armored vehicles. When men were killed or wounded, the pilots filled gaps in the line. When the perimeter shrank, they fell back and held the next position. For 9 days they fought, not as pilots waiting for rescue, but as soldiers defending ground. The losses at Arnhem were severe across all units involved. The glider pilot regiment suffered casualties that reflected the intensity of the fighting they were involved in, but the critical point is that they were there, in the line, holding positions that might otherwise have collapsed earlier. Without them, the evacuation of the survivors, Operation Berlin, which extracted roughly 2,400 men across the Rhine, might not have been possible at all. There is a detail from Arnhem that encapsulates the whole idea of the total soldier. Among the men holding the perimeter were glider pilots, who had flown their machines from England 2 days earlier, who had landed on the drop zones north of Arnhem, who had then marched toward the town as part of the fighting column, who had fought in the streets, and who were now crouching in a slit trench in a Dutch garden listening to German tanks moving on the road outside. These were aviators, trained, certified, qualified military pilots. And they were doing this, not because they had no choice, not because something had gone catastrophically wrong and they were pressed into service in desperation, but because this was exactly what they were trained and expected to do. This was the plan. The other thing that deserves attention is the organizational structure of the glider pilot regiment in combat on the ground. The pilots did not simply fight as individuals attached to the nearest infantry unit. They had their own command structure, their own sections and platoons, their own chain of command that operated independently on the ground. This was critical. An armed man without a command structure is not a soldier, he is a problem. The regiment had thought through not just the training but the organization. When glider pilots were employed as infantry, they were employed as an organized military unit, with officers in command, with communications, with tactical objectives assigned at the regimental and battalion level. This meant they could be directed, coordinated, and integrated with the paratroopers and ground forces they were fighting alongside. It meant that a regimental commander could look at his map and see the glider pilot regiment as a block of fighting power he could employ, not as a mass of armed individuals of uncertain utility. That organizational thinking was as important as the individual training, and it was another thing that set the British approach apart from anything else that existed at the time. Now let us talk about the gliders themselves for a moment, because understanding what the pilots were flying helps explain why the training had to be so thorough on the aviation side. The Horsa was the workhorse of British glider operations. It was a large, high-winged monoplane built primarily of wood, designed to carry substantial loads over meaningful distances when towed by aircraft like the Armstrong-Whitworth Albemarle, the Halifax, or the Stirling. The Horsa Mark I had a single-hold access through a large door on the port side, and it could carry a jeep and trailer, a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, or up to 28 fully equipped soldiers. The Horsa Mark II had a hinged nose section that allowed vehicles to be driven directly out of the front of the aircraft after landing. This was a significant operational advantage, as it reduced the time needed to unload heavy equipment. The pilot sat in a cockpit up front with good forward visibility, dual controls, and basic instruments including an airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, and rate of descent indicator. There was no radio communication between gliders during flight in most operations, which meant that once the formation was airborne, each pilot was essentially on his own, in terms of navigation and decision-making. The approach and landing were the most critical phases. The pilot had to manage his altitude and airspeed through a combination of flap settings and glide angle adjustments, aiming for a specific landing zone that might be partially obscured by smoke, fog, or darkness, that might have obstacles he had not been briefed on, and that might be under fire. The landing itself was at speeds of around 90 miles per hour on surfaces that might be soft enough to dig the nose in, rough enough to collapse the undercarriage, or interrupted by ditches, hedges, or walls. Casualties from the landing itself, separate from enemy fire, were a real factor in every major glider operation. Beyond the Horsa, the British also used the General Aircraft Hamilcar, a much larger glider designed to carry heavy equipment, including the Tetrarch light tank. The Hamilcar was the largest Allied glider of the war, with a wingspan of 110 feet and a capacity of nearly 8 tons. Flying a Hamilcar required additional training and represented the upper end of what a single crew of 2 pilots could manage in a combat environment. The point of all this is that glider pilots were not flying simple aircraft. The machines were demanding, the conditions were extreme, and the consequences of error were fatal. The aviation side of the training was not a token add-on to the main job of being a soldier. It was a genuine and difficult technical skill that had to be maintained and practiced continuously. And yet these men were also maintaining their infantry skills at the same time. That dual requirement placed a constant demand on time and resources that the regiment managed through a training schedule that left little room for anything else. There are accounts from glider pilots describing training periods during which they flew in the morning and ran assault courses or conducted section attacks in the afternoon, day after day, for weeks. The physical and mental load was substantial. The men who came through that pipeline and qualified for operations were not ordinary soldiers in any sense. They had been shaped by a process that demanded they be genuinely excellent at 2 things that most men were barely adequate at 1. The human dimension of this deserves more attention than it usually gets. These were young men, most of them in their early 20s, some younger. They had volunteered for a role that they knew was going to put them in extreme danger twice. Once in the air, where the risks of glider operations were well understood and widely discussed, and once on the ground, where they would be fighting as infantry in the kind of close combat that produced the highest casualty rates of any military activity. The men who volunteered for the glider pilot regiment were not unaware of what they were signing up for. There was no false advertising. The regiment was explicit about what was expected, and the men who came forward and stayed were the ones who had accepted both halves of the deal. That says something about the culture of the unit, which was genuine and distinguishable from other formations. The glider pilot regiment had a sense of identity that was built around the total soldier concept. They were not pilots who occasionally had to fight. They were soldiers who happened to be pilots. That distinction sounds subtle, but it was not. It shaped how the men thought about themselves, how they trained, how they behaved in the field, and how they led. Officers in the regiment were expected to set the standard in both disciplines. A flight commander who was an excellent pilot but a mediocre soldier was not what the regiment needed. The expectation ran from the commanding officer down to the most junior second pilot, and it was enforced through the training system and through the culture of the unit. There is also something worth noting about the relationship between the glider pilot regiment and the airborne formations they supported. The British 1st Airborne Division and the 6th Airborne Division both included glider-borne infantry as a fundamental part of their structure. These units, the air landing brigades, were equipped and trained to fight from gliders, to land in heavy formations, and immediately operate as organized infantry. The glider pilot regiment worked closely with these formations, and there was a mutual understanding of what each brought to the operation. The paratroopers jumped. The glider infantry arrived by Horsa. The glider pilots flew them there and then fought alongside them. That triangular relationship gave the British Airborne Division a flexibility and a depth that the American Airborne Divisions, for all their excellence, did not quite replicate. After the war, veterans of the glider pilot regiment were often asked what the training had been like, and a recurring theme in their accounts is the sheer relentlessness of it. Not brutal in the sense of pointless hardship, but relentless in the sense that it never let up. that the two halves of the job never allowed for the luxury of specializing in one and neglecting the other. One veteran described it as learning to fly an aircraft in the morning and then spending the afternoon learning to kill someone quietly with a knife. The contrast was extreme, but the juxtaposition was the point. You had to be able to do both, and you had to be able to do both well. Another recurring theme is the sense of confidence that the training produced. Men who had been through the full pipeline, who were qualified both as pilots and as infantry soldiers, carried themselves differently than men who had been trained in only one of those worlds. They knew what they could do, they had been tested in both domains, and they had passed. That confidence was not arrogance. It was the earned certainty of a man who has been thoroughly prepared for the worst that is likely to happen and knows it. That psychological dimension of preparation is often undervalued in discussions of military training. It is not just about what skills a soldier has, it is about what he believes about himself when the training is over and the operation begins. The glider pilot who lands his Horsa under fire, who gets out of the cockpit and organizes his co-pilot and the men nearest to him into a fighting position while the paratroopers he delivered move toward their objective, is drawing on something more than tactical knowledge. He is drawing on a certainty about his own capability that was built over 18 months of unrelenting dual-track training. That certainty is what allows him to make decisions quickly in chaos, to act rather than freeze, to lead rather than look around for someone else to follow. The training produced not just skills but character, and character, in combat, is often the decisive factor. Let us go to Arnhem one more time, because the full story of what the Glider Pilot Regiment did there has never been as well known as it deserves to be. Operation Market Garden launched on the 17th of September 1944. The British 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, was tasked with capturing the road bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem and holding it until the ground forces of Texkorps could relieve them, and anti-aircraft defenses near the town, which meant that the element of surprise was lost before the men could reach their objective. Only a single battalion, the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge and held it. The rest of the division was stopped well short by German forces that had reacted with startling speed and efficiency. The perimeter contracted, the fighting was ferocious, and among the men defending that contracting perimeter were the pilots of the Glider Pilot Regiment. The regiment at Arnhem was organized into 2 wings for ground combat. They were assigned sectors of the perimeter and held them. They fought in the suburban streets and gardens of Oosterbeek, where the main perimeter had formed around the division's headquarters. The fighting in Oosterbeek was the kind that infantry soldiers dread most. Close, confused, lethal, and relentless. The Germans brought armored vehicles along the roads. They used mortars and artillery. They infiltrated between positions. They attacked in the early morning and again at dusk. The men in the perimeter held their positions with whatever they had, which included the small arms and anti-tank weapons the glider pilots had trained extensively to use. There are accounts of glider pilots using Piats against German armored vehicles at ranges of less than 50 meters. There are accounts of them holding buildings against repeated infantry assaults, using the fire and movement tactics they had drilled over and over during training. There are accounts of pilots taking command of sections when the infantry NCO was killed or wounded, organizing the defense, making the decisions that kept the position from being overrun. This was not improvisation. This was training functioning as it was designed to. The men did what they had been taught to do, under conditions that were worse than anything the training had prepared them for, and they did it well enough to hold the perimeter for 9 days. The evacuation on the night of the 25th to 26th of September, Operation Berlin, extracted roughly 2,400 of the approximately 10,000 men who had gone in. The Glider Pilot Regiment's casualties at Arnhem were significant. Of the approximately 1,100 pilots who had flown into the operation, a substantial proportion became casualties through death, wounding, or capture. But the regiment's contribution to the defense cannot be measured only in losses. It can be measured in the positions that held, the days that were bought, and the men who got out across the Rhine because the perimeter had not collapsed earlier. After Arnhem, after the bitter lessons and the enormous losses, the regiment rebuilt and continued operations. The Rhine crossing in March 1945, Operation Varsity, was the last major airborne operation of the war in Europe, and the Glider Pilot Regiment participated. By then, some of the hard lessons had been learned. The coordination between air and ground was better. The intelligence was better. The timing was better. Varsity was a success. establishing a crossing over the Rhine that helped accelerate the final push into Germany. And through varsity and into the final weeks of the war, the glider pilot regiment remained what it had always been designed to be. Not just a means of transport, but a fighting force that happened to arrive by air. There is something in the concept of the total soldier that transcends the specific circumstances of the Second World War and speaks to something more fundamental about what military organizations are and what they ask of the people within them. The standard that the glider pilot regiment set, the insistence that its men would be complete soldiers across two demanding disciplines, was a statement about what was possible, about what men could be trained to achieve when the requirement was clear and the preparation was honest. It is also a statement about the relationship between training and reality. The British military had looked at what these men were actually going to face, not what the plan assumed they would face, not the optimistic scenario, but the real one, where gliders scattered across miles of enemy territory, where plans disintegrated on contact, where every man with a weapon might be the difference between a position holding and collapsing. They had built a training system to match that reality. And when the reality arrived, as it always does in war, and it was worse than anyone had expected, the men had something to draw on. The training was deep enough, thorough enough, honest enough about what combat actually looks like, that it held. Not perfectly. Nothing holds perfectly in war, but enough. Enough that the positions at Pegasus Bridge were held. Enough that the perimeter at Arnhem lasted 9 days instead of 2. Enough that the missions that succeeded as completely as they did. The glider pilot regiment was disbanded in 1957 as the age of the military glider came to an end and helicopters took over the role of delivering troops and equipment by air. The men who served in it dispersed into civilian life, into other regiments, into the new Army Air Corps that replaced it. Many of them talked little about what they had done. The airborne veterans of the Second World War are mostly gone now, and the specific memory of what the glider pilot regiment was and what it achieved has faded into the background of a war that had so many stories it was always going to lose some of them, but the concept they embodied has not entirely disappeared. The idea that a soldier should be capable across multiple domains, that the training should match the reality of what combat requires, rather than a sanitized version of it, that organizations should not carry men who are only partially prepared for what they will face. That idea survived and influenced military thinking in ways that are traceable even today. Special Forces doctrine, which demands that soldiers be qualified across a range of capabilities that would once have been considered impossible to combine in a single individual, owes something to the logic that the British applied in building the glider pilot regiment. The total soldier was an early version of an idea that has become central to how the most effective military units in the world are built and trained, but there is another dimension to this story that is worth sitting with before we finish, and that is the dimension of what it cost. The men of the glider pilot regiment paid for that dual standard with their lives, their health, and their years. The training was long and hard. The operations were dangerous. The casualties were heavy. Arnhem alone produced losses among the regiment that would have broken a lesser unit. The men who flew into Sicily and came down in the sea, who flew into Normandy in darkness and landed in fields they had never seen, who flew into Arnhem knowing what they were likely to face and did it anyway, these were not abstractions. They were young men with families and futures and names. The scale of the investment the British made in training each of them, 18 months to 2 years, the resources, the instructors, the aircraft, the ammunition, the time, and the willingness of those young men to give all of it back in a wooden glider over enemy territory, these things deserve to be remembered with the same gravity that we remember the operations themselves. The training was extraordinary, the concept all good training is for. If this is the kind of deep dive you want more of, the forgotten corners of the Second World War, the stories that get overlooked because the big battles take all the space, then subscribe. There are more of these waiting, and they are worth your time.